All right, thank you all so much for joining us. So what I'm going to do, and what I did in the last webinar as well, is share the final project guide for Eco 201, because this kind of goes over in a little bit more detail the expectations for tackling each of the critical elements in the final paper. So this milestone, as you know from last time, each milestone is just a section of your paper. So this milestone covers section 2, or Roman numeral 2, and section 3 of your final paper. So the first section that we're covering is supply and demand conditions. So you don't have to have necessarily a separate title page for all this. Ideally, you've already got your title page written. You can continue adding to what you have for milestone 1, because again, this is just a continuation of your final paper. Think of each of these as rough drafts of each section. So you already submitted the rough draft of section 1. That was what you submitted before. So you already have your title page written. You already have section 1 written. Now you're going to be submitting rough draft of section 2 and section 3. So feel free to type your questions in the chat. We've got Bill Criswell as an instructor with us. We might have a couple other instructors on the line. I haven't looked at the whole list, but he will be helping me out and answering your questions. As those questions come in, we do our best to answer them quickly, and then I'll be going over the basics of what you find in the guide and helping everyone make sense of that for the next half hour. So Sharon asks, do we submit the entire document, including section 1 this week? So Sharon, it's up to you if you want to submit them as one full document or separately. You will only be graded on section 2 and section 3, whether or not you submit section 1. So if you have made any edits to section 1, so that's the introduction and the history and overview of your company, if you've made any edits there since you passed in your milestone, your instructor is not going to revisit those and give you more feedback. Your instructor is only going to be looking at section 2 and section 3 and giving you feedback on the elements in those sections. And it looks like Jessica asked if it's run away from me. Are there good websites to find 5-year accurate data for graphs? Jessica, that's a great question. We are going to get to that when I go through that bit in a minute, but the data that you get might not already be in graph form. So usually it's all the data that you need for the revenue for your company is in their annual reports. So you can take that data from there. Usually it's often in a table, and you can create your own graph. We can talk about that. All right, so Ruby looks like has a question on the first element. So in this section, so we're going to go ahead and jump into there since we've got a question there. So you're looking for the first element in the supply and demand conditions section. You're asked to evaluate the trends in demand over time and explain their impact on the industry and on your firm. So when we talk about the industry as a whole, that's obviously going to be specific to your particular company. So if you chose Southwest, that would be air travel in general. If you chose Coca-Cola, that would be the soft drink industry and maybe the beverage industry in general, or the non-alcoholic beverage industry. If you chose Nike, that would be athletic wear and sneakers. So in any of those industries, there's going to be certain trends in demand, and we've got all of the determinants listed out here for you, things that impact trends in demand. There's going to be certain trends in demand over time that make companies within that industry change the way that they operate, whether that's the kinds of products and services that they offer, or where they offer those products and services, or how they compete with one another. So that's what you're going to want to look at. So we've got the major determinants of market demand to help you identify some of those trends in demand. So income is a major determinant of demand. So as people become more wealthy, for most goods, for normal goods, they will generally demand more of them. price of related goods impacts demand for your goods. So in the air travel industry, if travel by other ways changes, gets more expensive or gets less expensive, that might have an impact on certain aspects of the air travel industry. So for instance, I'm sure the air travel industry wouldn't be too excited about lots of high-speed rail between Californian cities or Texan cities, or even, up and down the eastern seaboard, because that might provide more competition for them, and that would impact their industry. So that would be an impact that it has on the industry, the price of related goods, if that became much cheaper or became better. Tastes is one of the biggest ones you're going to be looking at. So just people's general preferences. So Coca-Cola is a great example of that one. That's a company on our list that a lot of you do. A lot of people are trying to move away from sugary foods and beverages. So that, of course, is impacting the soft drink industry. If there's a trend in certain kinds of clothing or a trend in certain kind of automobiles, that's going to affect all the companies in that industry. So Ruby, that's how you look at their impact on the industry over time. Usually companies will recognize these changing preferences and how income is affecting things and population and demographics, and they'll adjust how much they produce or the kinds of things that they produce or where they offer their products and services as they recognize those trends. Just making sure I haven't missed any questions. So James asked a great question. Should this checkpoint be 4 pages? James, I'd say that's a pretty good ballpark. 4 pages for some of you might be on the higher end, but since you're probably going to have at least one graph, that's probably a good ballpark. And if it's longer, that's fine. Generally, if you find that if you only have about 2 pages, especially if you've got a graph and it's only 2 pages, you probably haven't gone into enough detail in each of the 5 elements. So since we do have 5 elements to cover, and there's going to be a graph included, 4 pages is probably a good ballpark. And anything above that is fine. So hopefully I addressed this first element well. The really big piece to remember is that you are looking at the whole industry. So you're not just looking at demand for Ruby, in your case, General Motors vehicles, but automobiles overall. Or if you're doing Starbucks, you're not looking at demand just for Starbucks coffee, but maybe coffee overall and coffee house coffee. So are there more people drinking coffee? Are people starting to drink less coffee and drink more tea? Are people starting to drink coffee at a younger age? So that's the population and demographics bit. And which people go to coffee houses? Are people wanting to make more coffee at home, or are people wanting to drink coffee outside of the home more often? What do those trends look like? So if people want to drink more coffee out of the home, that helps Starbucks, but it also helps other places that are coffee shops like Pete's or Dunkin' Donuts, or to a lesser extent even McDonald's that now sells coffee and even higher end coffee. So it's really important for this first element that you take a broad look at the industry in terms of the demand for the product or service, and not just your specific company all by itself. Great, okay, I don't see any outstanding questions. And we do have quite a few elements to get through, so I'm gonna jump to the next one. Oh, Brittany has a question. So Brittany asks, can we incorporate information on our company while discussing the industry as a whole? Yeah, Brittany, and that will be a great transition to the second element, which is specific to your company. I just want to make sure that when you're talking about demand, you do look at demand overall. So if you do, like in Ruby's instance, she's looking at General Motors. If you want to talk about the trend for automobiles over time, you could look at how many cars are purchased in the United States over the past 5 or 10 years. How has that changed? Are people buying more and more cars every year? Are more SUVs sold each year, or more hybrid cars sold each year? What do those trends look like overall? And then you can break it down to your own specific company. So just as long as you include the overall picture, then you can drill down to your own company. I just don't want you to forget the industry as a whole altogether, because that does happen to some students sometimes, and then they unnecessarily lose points. So Jessica asks, so supply is, for example, coffee houses in general when you're referring to Starbucks. So Jessica, in this case, when we're talking about the trends in demand, if you're doing a company like Starbucks, you would want to look at demand for coffee overall, so just like coffee drinkers, and then more narrowly, demand for people going to coffee shops, to coffee houses. The more coffee drinkers there are in the world, the better that is for Starbucks. But then they might want to look at it a little closer. Okay, more people are drinking coffee now than ever before because that's just their tastes and preferences, or that's how the population and demographics have gone. Are more of those people going to the coffee shop, or are they drinking coffee at home? What's the trend there? As a business in the coffee industry, they want to know what those trends looks like so they can react accordingly. So Carol asks, if your company has an array of products, can you choose to focus on just the product line that they are most well known for? Carol, I'd say that's a good approach. Without knowing the exact company, I don't want to be too specific and say that that's definitely what you ought to do. Some companies are known for one particular product, but they still make a lot of their money from other products that might not be as well known to the average consumer. So, and especially when you're going to be looking at their financial data, their revenue and their cost data, if a lot of that revenue and cost data is coming from other things, then it might be telling a different story than just looking at that particular product. So I'd say that's a generally good approach, but you might want to at least consider what those other products or services are doing and how they're impacting the company's bottom line. It's Smith & Wesson. So generally Smith & Wesson, you're going to be talking about firearms in general. So if that's, I wouldn't talk about just one particular firearm with Smith & Wesson. I know that they make other products that wouldn't be considered firearms, but I wouldn't just limit yourself to one kind of firearm that they make that they're best known for, but look at, their handguns and their rifles instead of just one particular make or model, however they're referred to. So Ruby asks, are we looking at the income for the year or on a quarterly basis? Great question, Ruby. Annual revenue for your company is what you'll need to look at for the second element. So the second element here is asking you to analyze information and data related to the demand and supply for your firm's products to support your recommendation for the firm's actions. So one really easy way to look at demand and supply of a particular company is to look at revenue, because that's how much they're selling, at least in dollar terms, right? So definitely include that. For all of your companies, they should all be publicly traded, and you can get that information from their annual reports. So you should have annual revenue information. You don't have to submit it quarterly, but if you want to show it quarterly for the past 5 or more years, you certainly can. But annual numbers are fine. The reason we say 5 years is because that's just enough to show a solid trend. But you can certainly include more, especially if there was something that happened in your industry or something specific to your company that occurred slightly more than 5 years ago that you want to include in sort of the story that you're telling. So Ruby asks if it'll be 5 years back or 5 years forward. You would only have historical information for that, Ruby. So we don't know what the revenue is going to be for your company 5 years from now. So you'll be using back data. So 2016 to 2012 is 5 years. So 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So at least back to 2012. And that way you can say, okay, are they selling more by revenue year over year? Is it increasing, but increasing at a slower rate? Is it decreasing? And once you have that laid out, you can then start to explain why that's the case. However it's moving, you'll be able to explain why in this section. So you're just looking at revenue. You don't want to look at profit just yet, since profit is a function of how much you sell, but also what your costs are. Right now, we're just focusing on revenue. So Michelle asks, for Panera Bread, because the variety of products, what would be the comparison? I would say for Panera Bread, the industry that you're looking at is, I believe they call it fast casual, but it's the the fast casual restaurant industry in general. So separate from restaurants that have, waiters and waitresses. I hope that answers your question, Michelle. So it's really important, again, for this second element in this section that you get that revenue data. Another great way, which might not be possible depending on your company. Again, everybody can do revenue, but some other companies you can look at demand and supply in additional ways, such as number of members, like Netflix has membership numbers. For a car company, you might be able to find number of automobiles sold, things like that. So you can show increases in number of sales that aren't in dollar terms. So that's another important way, another useful way of looking at things. A company could sell more and more each year, but if the price is increasing, they might just be selling the same amount of things, but just at a higher price each year. So if you're able to get some information on number of items sold, for instance, or if it's a service, number of members, that's another useful comparison. Yeah, so Sharon mentions that the annual report is very overwhelming. They are often very long. The good news is you don't actually have to go through too much of it. You want to skip to the part where it just shows their financial data. So the revenue is usually one of the first lines, one of the first line items that they have there. And then it will quickly go to the cost information, which we're going to get into on the next milestone. So you don't have to worry about the cost information yet, but the revenue data should be right there at the top. And generally in the part of the annual report, right before it gets into the financial information, they sort of give a sort of state of the union address for their company and their industry. How they see the company doing, what's been going well for the company, what they see happening in the industry. So that's really important to read. The stuff you can skip over is the stuff about their stock, the stuff about changes to any dividend prices or who their shareholders are. That kind of stuff we can skip over. That's more about their corporate structure and corporate governance and how they're rewarding shareholders and all that. That is not very relevant to the work you need to do in this paper. So you really want to skip to the stuff that's about the work that they're doing in terms of producing their good or service, selling their good or service, and where they see themselves in the industry. And then usually from there, that's when they get into the financial data. So you can cut through a lot of the stuff at the beginning. So Joshua asks, how do you suggest we relate this element to supporting our recommendation when we don't have a recommendation yet? Joshua, you don't actually have to talk about your recommendation yet. It's just the wording of this is designed, of course, for your final product at the end. But for here, it's just, this is going to set you up for your recommendation at the end. Even though you don't have to speak to it in this element. It's just something that will be able to support it. So the data that you collect and show and talk about, how you see that revenue trend moving or number of sales moving, that will be part of what informs your recommendation. So yeah, that can be a little confusing. So I'm glad you asked that question. Yep. So Ruby, this is being recorded and it will be shared via a YouTube link in all of your courses by tomorrow afternoon. You can also search for the SNU Eco channel on YouTube, and it will be posted there as well. All right, so we talked a bit about sales and revenue data. Again, at the very least, revenue, and if you can also get sales data that's not in dollar terms, that's a useful thing too. So you can share that in a graph. And then just some additional ways to look at how a company supplies their product. We have the determinants for supply. So you can things like trends and input costs, which you're going to look at a little bit more in the cost section on the next milestone. So I wouldn't advise you to focus on that too much here, but technological improvements, prices of substitutes, number of firms in the market, and expected future prices are just a few of them. Some other things to consider are how they're growing. So are they adding a lot of more locations if they're like a Starbucks or something like that where they need more locations to serve more people, or an automotive manufacturer might be changing the number of production facilities that they have, or reducing the number of production facilities they have, or increasing the number of dealerships that they have. Those are things you want to look at. Are they changing the way that they make their product or service through a technological improvement? So that's something you can consider too. I know, like at McDonald's, they've got all this fancy stuff going on to take orders from the drive-through. I don't know if any of you guys have witnessed this, but it was actually pretty impressive to me when I saw it a couple of years ago. And I imagine that just makes their service at the drive-through much faster, which helps their business. Then they can serve more customers. So that would be something that on the supply side that they've been able to do a better job of through a technological improvement, so that they can serve more people as demand increases for any particular location. Yeah, input costs, Ruby, refers to anything that goes into making your product or service. So since you're doing General Motors, that would be the people that are in the production facilities building the cars, the steel that goes into the cars, or the rubber for the tires, the glass, the leather, all that. All right, so we are getting into the section 3, the second section we have to do here. And this can be a little tricky, so I do want to be able to spend some time with it. The first element here, excuse me, is asking you to analyze information and data to justify how the price elasticity of demand for your product is determined. So what I really want to stress is that for the vast majority of you, almost all of you, in most cases, you're not going, because of the company that you chose and the information available to us, we're not going to be able to calculate the price elasticity of demand to an actual number like you did in your homework, or if you've done your homework yet for this. Actually, no, it was last week. So in that, you had the data, you had the change in quantity, you had the change in price, and you were able to calculate price elasticity of demand. In this case, you're not going to have change in quantity number and a change in price number to be able to do that. So that's not our expectation. That, your instructor's not expecting that of you. What we are looking for here is for you to say, demand for my product is elastic, or demand for my product is inelastic. So you're not putting a number on it, but you are putting this sort of characteristic on it, either inelastic demand or elastic demand. And the way that you are going to justify this is by looking at some general information and data on your company. So one way that I find is really helpful for students to do this is to do a little bit of general research on your product. So for instance, if you're doing Southwest Airlines, you can research price elasticity of demand for air travel. And there's, professional economists that have, written papers about these things, and you can use their research and include it in your paper and say, the price elasticity of demand for this service in general, or this product in general is 0.5. So that would be inelastic demand, since it's less than 1. So people aren't very responsive to a price change in that instance. So if you know that about the product in general, you can then take that and use it to make an inference about what it would be like for your company's product or service in particular. So if air travel overall is just a little bit inelastic, people are not very responsive to price change. You know that for any one given company, they're going to be a little bit more responsive, because at the very least, they could go to another airline, let's say. And then the more options there are, the more elastic they'll be for any one given company. So that's one of the determinants of price elasticity of demand. So these first two elements are very strongly linked. So you can do some research about the general elasticity for your product and then back it up from there to talk about your company in particular. Again, any given company is going to be more elastic than the good or service overall, because you're just looking at one company out of many in most cases. And then you can also look at their pricing data. So if you know that your company offers lots of sales or is always competing on price with their competitors, that indicates elastic demand. A company would only have a sale on their product if they thought it would bring in more revenue. Otherwise, they wouldn't cut the price if it wasn't going to help them increase revenue. So a company that offers sales a lot, that indicates elastic demand. Or companies that are always trying to undercut each other on price, again, that indicates elastic demand for their particular product or service. All right, see some questions, but they're getting answered. That's great. So those are a couple of the ways that you could use information and data, whether that's general research information or data specific to your company's, the way that they price their products, to justify whether demand is inelastic or elastic. Again, it's really important that at the end of this element, you've stated either elastic or inelastic demand. And if your company has a couple of different products, it's possible that demand for one is elastic and demand for the other is inelastic. That's fine too, and you can talk about those separately. Brittany, that's a great, so Brittany says, what if the industry is elastic, but my company doesn't have sales or cut prices? That's just one example, one way to look at it. You can just discuss, you can, again, as I mentioned, you can do research on price elasticity of demand for clothing. And that should be out there. I feel like I've found that myself out there. And if you're really lucky, you might be able to find something specific to athletic wear. But you can also use the determinants of demand to help you, to help support, justify your answer. Looking at sales is just one way, but you know, Lululemon might sometimes cut their prices. I don't know if they've ever reduced their price as more competition has come on. That might be a way to look at it. Again, look, having a sale is just one example, one way to do this. So the determinants of demand, the determinants of price elasticity of demand are how you're going to explain the factors that affect consumer responsiveness to price changes. So consumer responsiveness to price changes is just price elasticity. It's just another way to say that. The more responsive consumers are, that's elastic. If they are not very responsive, that's inelastic demand. And these are the 5 things that affect that we talk about in the textbook. So availability of substitutes, the more substitutes there are, the more elastic demand is going to be. Passage of time. This one is not always as applicable to some industries as to another, but over time, people can find ways to get around buying your product and switch their lifestyle or their own preferences to get something else. So gasoline is a great example. We talked about that last week. I have a car today. I live where I live. This is my commute time. But if gas prices continuously go up over time, I might make some changes in my life where I can buy less gas. Even though I can't do that tomorrow, maybe 5 years from now, I can make that happen by buying a different car or moving so my commute time isn't as much, those sorts of things. Luxury or necessity is another big one. Generally, luxuries are more price elastic and necessities are inelastic. So water would be something inelastic. We need water. Gasoline is another great example, especially in the short run. Electricity, things like that. A luxury like a Caribbean vacation, I don't need to go on that. So if I see a great deal on a Caribbean vacation, I might go on a whim. If all of a sudden prices on Caribbean vacations go up, I'll probably pass. I'll be more likely to skip it if there's a price increase, since I don't need it. Definition of market. This speaks to a little bit about what I talked about with the research bit. And I know we're at 9 o'clock, so Eco 202 students, if you're here, bear with me while we finish up the last element. Definition of market is just the more narrowly you define your market, the more elastic demand will get. So if you talk about travel in general, that could be air travel, it could be car travel, it could be train travel. So people have travel needs in general. And for that, it would be inelastic demand. I need to take my travel, I'm going to find a way to do it. But as you narrow it down, as you narrow down how you define the market, it becomes more elastic, because then now people have more choice as well. I don't want to take the train, I can drive, or I could take a plane. And then when you even further narrow the market to a specific company, demand for Southwest or demand for Starbucks, then it becomes even more elastic because now you can choose a very similar product, but just from a different company. And lastly, share of budget. So share of budget is a big one. When something is a big portion of your budget, you're very price sensitive because even a small percentage change in price is a lot of your own money. Whereas something that's very cheap already, if the price doubled, you might not even notice because, you know, going from $1 to $2 isn't going to break your bank account compared to doubling the price of a car. That would be a much bigger hit to everyone's incomes than, or everyone's budgets than the price of salt doubling. So Brittany asks, I would say my company is broadening the market by selling men's clothing. That's more what they're doing on the supply side, Brittany. When you're looking at price elasticity of demand, you would say, you know, the demand for clothing in general, you know, people need clothes, so that's a necessity. That's generally going to be inelastic. But for any one particular brand of clothing, it's going to be more and more elastic, less inelastic, because if one company's prices increase, I can just go and buy clothes from another company. I don't need to buy it from this particular company if they've decided to increase their prices. So this isn't so much about different offerings and different kinds of things, but more how people respond to prices at a certain level. So if all clothing, if tomorrow, all clothes in all of the United States increased by 10%, probably people would buy about the same amount of clothes. But if just Macy's increased all their prices by 10%, I guarantee you that Macy's would have a big problem because people could go to many other stores. Hopefully that makes sense. And the last one here, and I know we're a bit over time, so I'm going to try to be brief, but help everyone see what you need to do, is to assess how the price elasticity of demand impacts the firm's pricing decisions. So this is where we want to help you guys make sure that you guys can show your understanding of how the price elasticity, whether it's inelastic or elastic, impacts the firm's revenue. So that's a big part of how they decide to increase prices, decrease prices, or try to keep prices the same. So with a company like Starbucks is a great example. We hear a lot about coffee bean prices going up. So they have to make a determination. Our costs are increasing. Coffee beans are getting more expensive. What are we going to do? Are we going to pass those costs off to the consumer? Are we going to increase prices tomorrow and risk losing some customers? Are we going to eat that cost and keep prices the same? Or if coffee bean prices go down, are we going to decrease prices? If we decrease prices, we're going to make less revenue for each cup, but will we get a lot more customers by doing that? Is it worth it, or should we just keep the savings ourselves? So based on price elasticity of demand, a company can answer this question. The relationship between price elasticity demand and total revenue is explained in this video. So when demand is elastic, people are pretty responsive to a price change. If you increase the price, your revenue will decrease. If demand were inelastic and you increase the price, your revenue will actually go up. You lose a few customers, but not enough, and you're charging a higher price now, so those who stayed end up giving you more revenue. So that's it in a nutshell, but we've got the link to the video here, so you can refresh your memories. We are 5 minutes over. You guys had so many great questions. Thank you so much. It really helps when we do that. Any last burning questions before we hop over to our patient 202 students? All right, and if you think of a question, when you read through this more carefully, when you start doing your own research, when you watch the recording tomorrow, if you have any questions, you're like, that wasn't totally clear, I don't know how this applies to my company, just email your instructor as soon as you have that question in your head. We love to talk about this stuff. This is why we teach, so don't feel like it's a silly question or that it's not worth it to ask. It always is. So please don't hesitate if you have any questions like that. And do take a look at this on as you do your research and use it as a guide as you go. because and a lot of the links can be very helpful in refreshing your memory about these concepts and how to apply them. All right, thank you all so much. And everyone here from 202, thank you for waiting 6 minutes. We really appreciate it. It was a very long milestone for our 2012 students. Your milestone is shorter, so I think we'll still be able to finish on time. Just going to switch over to 202 guide. And here we go. We are not in the right spot. Let me scroll down. All right, so this is the full guide, but like we talked about from last week, you're only submitting, you're only submitting a handful of the slides that you need as a rough draft. So you submitted the first 5 elements of your final project in week 2's milestone, in milestone 1. In milestone 2, you're going to be submitting the slides for fiscal policy. So that's what we're going to focus on tonight. So thank you all for joining us. So this milestone is going to be between 3 to 5 slides long, depending on how many fiscal policy actions you need to talk about. So the first slide on fiscal policy is asking you to look at the policies in place at the start of your chosen decade. So, or 10-year time period. It doesn't have to be an actual decade. Some people choose to start in the middle of a decade and go 10 years. So what this means, fiscal policy generally refers to the policies that the federal government puts in place via spending, government spending, and taxation to impact the economy. So tax rates are at a specific level because the federal government believes that that is what is appropriate to keep the economy going. Those tax rates change from time to time as the economy cycles. We have a business cycle, and a lot of what the federal government does on the side of things is to change tax rates and spending to counteract some of that business cycle, so the economy doesn't overheat, and so we don't go into too deep of recessions. They do the best they can, I hope. We're going to say that. The idea is to help smooth out the business cycle, even though we know from history that doesn't always work. We do still experience recessions, and we do sometimes have overheating in the economy, but in general, this is the idea behind fiscal policy. So you're going to want to look at what those policies look like at the start of your decade. So at the start of your decade, there was some level of corporate taxation, there was some level of personal income taxation, and there was some level of spending. There's lots of different kinds of spending programs, and you can look at what was in place at the time, what the rules around unemployment were, those autonomous spending programs, so unemployment insurance, welfare type spending. Those are the things you'll want to look at and sort of summarize, so we get a lay of the land, how things started off in your decade, your 10-year time period. So some places to start looking are the Congressional Budget Office, White House website, and to a lesser extent, the National Bureau of Economic Research. But the first two are going to be helpful in just finding out what was happening. It's best to search by president. So if you type in, 1985 fiscal policy, you might not have a lot of luck. But if you type in fiscal policy Ronald Reagan, you'll have much better success. So whether you go to Congressional Budget Office or the White House website, or if you just, go to Google, you'll do much better by searching by president. And then once you search by president, you'll see lots of different policies or tax rate changes or whatever were put in place, and you'll know when that was put in place. So let's say that you're doing the 90s, and there was a policy put in place in 1988 or 1989. Chances are that was still in place by 1990. And then, it takes a few years for things to change. A new president is elected, new Congress, new congressmen, new senators. So sometimes to find out what was already in place, you might have to look back a couple years to see what happened. Okay, in 1988, they put in this decision on tax rates, and that was still the law as of 1990. So again, this is just laying the groundwork so we can see in the next slide how those policies around government spending and federal taxation changed throughout the 10 years that you're analyzing. Oh, Anthony, I haven't heard of that. Bill or Kiara, I don't know if you guys have, but that sounds great. I'll have to check it out. Thank you for sharing. So the next slide, or this actually might take some students more than one slide, so I should say the next element. The next element is on fiscal policy actions. So these are actions that were taken after the start of your 10-year time period. So at the very beginning of your 10-year time period, this is what this is what the taxation rates were. This is what the spending policy was in terms of all these government spending programs that are aimed at impacting the economy in one way or another. But the economy changes as those 10 years go on. And so these policies change in response to the changes in the economy through the business cycle. So you're going to want to look at what those changes are. Now, some of your time periods are going to be a little bit more active in terms of fiscal policy than others. There's no 10-year time period that has absolutely no fiscal policy action. But if you only find a couple of things and you're like, geez, I don't know if this is enough, you might have just a quieter 10-year time period. Do make sure that you try to look through all the presidents that were in your 10-year time period, because usually at least every president, because they tend to bring in a lot, a new Congress and new senators with them, just because of the voting cycle and how the politics of it works. When the new leadership comes in, you'll often see a lot of these actions take place because different people have different ideas about how to impact the economy. So if you're only looking at one president and you only find a couple fiscal policy actions, definitely look to the president that comes after. Oh, I'm not sure. Oh, Kiara, are you talking about that website? I wasn't familiar with that. That sounds great. So for the fiscal policy actions, you're going to be looking at a handful of different policy actions that were taken by the federal government in your 10-year time period. And here you're going to go into a little bit more detail about them. So this compared to the last slide. So on these slides, you're really going to want to talk about how the macroeconomic principles and models explain why the action would lead to the desired outcome. So for instance, if the policy is trying to help reduce unemployment, the unemployment rate, you can use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model to explain why whatever they're doing would lead to that outcome, theoretically. So this is a chance for you to apply the theory side to some real actions that were taken. As always, you're going to keep the main points on the slide. You could try to create your own, very simple, doesn't have to have any numbers on the axis, aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, little graph if you'd like to. It's pretty simple to do in PowerPoint. You just draw the lines. And then you can show a shift. So you can show a shift in the aggregate demand based on whatever the policy was. And that will help you explain, okay, we see how the aggregate demand curve shifted based on this policy action. And this explains why it impacted GDP or unemployment or inflation. You could also borrow a graph, if you find it from our textbook or find it online, if it already shows the movement that you want to show in the aggregate demand, you could borrow it instead of creating it yourself. And then the notes section, as always, is where you're going to give the further explanation. All right, and last but not least, scholarly research is required. A lot of this might be from the same place you found it for the last slide, especially if you're talking about a particular president. So you might find a site, like let's say from the White House website, that talks about the policies of a particular president. So if a president was making lots of changes in their policies to respond to changes in the economy, that might have been something you talked about on the first slide because it was in place at the beginning of your time period. But then they put new policies in place as the years go by. And so you're using that same research to talk about actions taken here. So that happens a lot. but do use those websites. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with using Shapiro Library, they are a fantastic resource. And one thing that I've found helpful for myself when I've been trying to find things is to use the chat feature. So if you go to the Shapiro Library, you type in what you're looking for, you're really not finding it. You can click the chat 24/7 with a librarian, or might just say chat with a librarian, and you just start talking with somebody. You can say, hey, this is what I'm looking for. And they are like magicians. I mean, they're very good at what they do. They go and they search for that thing, and they're just really good at how to use search terms and where to look. And they'll come back with a few options of what they found for you. And in my experience, they've always been really successful and have helped me find exactly what I was looking for. So do give that a try sooner than later. That way you can work it out, make sure that you're able to find what you need and not rushing on Sunday to get it done. But the good news is they're 24/7. So if you need them on Sunday, they'll be there. Yeah, Google Scholar is also a great one. I've used it not so much for things related to this final project, but for other things I've looked for, and it's been a huge help. So and another thing that I tell students, because they often ask, is, can I use Wikipedia? And I see Kiara has mentioned it. Wikipedia is a good jumping off point because they refer to a lot of scholarly research, or they'll refer to newspaper articles or websites that are reputable sources, like the Congressional Budget Office website or the White House website. Those are, sources that you can trust. But you can't cite Wikipedia itself. So you could go, like Reagan, Wikipedia, and you'll go and you'll find his very long Wikipedia page. And there'll be probably a whole section there on his economic policies. So you can read about them and sort of get the lay of the land by reading the Wikipedia page, but then you'll notice that they've got their own links with all, they have those little, those footnotes. And then a lot of those footnotes are hyperlinked. So you can go right to the source where they got it. And if it's not hyperlinked, you can always just take the title of whatever they're referring to and see if you can access it on the internet just through a browse search. Or if it doesn't come up through there, if it's behind some sort of paywall, or if you just can't find it, you can enter that title, the title of whatever that publication or paper was, into Shapiro Library, and they might have access to it. So Wikipedia has done a lot of that research for you already, and you can sort of piggyback off of it, but just don't cite it. All right, so the last one is fiscal policy impact. And I apologize, guys, because this slide that you have access to in your course has been updated. So I'm sorry that we have the outdated one here. It's still pretty much the same. It's not a big difference, and I'll talk about it. But just in case you notice that it's different, that's on me. This one should be updated here. But for this element, you're going to look at the actual impact of the fiscal policy. So the first thing you want to see is, did it do what it intended to do? If the policies, each of them separately, whatever, maybe one was trying to boost economic growth, maybe another was trying to reduce unemployment, maybe there was another that was aimed at controlling inflation. Any of those things, did they accomplish that goal, that particular goal, or a set of goals? And a lot of it, you can just look at the economic data that you've already compiled to see if it was able to help. And your research, a lot of the research that you might have already found can speak to that as well. The Congressional Budget Office does a lot of that, looking back at economic policies to see the impact that they had on the economy. So CBO is a great resource for looking at the actual impact. So there's the theory side, this is what it ought to do. And then there's the real world side, this is what actually happened. So you're going to sort of see how it shook out in the end, since you've already addressed the theory part. The other thing that we want you to analyze here in terms of impact is, how did it directly impact households and businesses? In a situation where you're trying to boost economic growth, was that through tax rates? So, okay, households saw their taxes decrease, and so they were able to spend more money on goods and services, and that's what boosted the economy, and it worked, and it was successful. But that's how it impacted households directly. Maybe on the other side, if it wasn't a tax if it was a tax decrease for corporations instead of households, okay, well, corporations saw their taxes lower, so they were able to, increase production or hire more workers or invest more in new technology, what have you. And you can see that in the data as well. So you can see that in investment numbers in your time period and talk about what that impact looked like. Or sometimes it's that, corporations or households get, let's say, a tax cut, but they save the money instead of spending it. So that's how you could talk about the impact as well. So what did the households and corporations do with the policy and how it affected them? So those are just some of the ways to look at things, but do consider the sort of micro impact for this section as well to really fully knock it out of the park. So Tim, great question. How far in the future should you go? For example, some of the policies as of the 90s are believed to be a factor in the 07 recession. So I would say if you happen to know that and you want to explore that, go for it. I don't think that we don't have an expectation of you have to go this far into the future, but we want to at least see the fairly immediate or near immediate impact of the policies, especially when they're in response to something like a recession, where the idea is that it will have a somewhat immediate or near-term impact. But if you happen to find some information or really want to explore the longer-term impact and include that here, I think that's phenomenal. So Donna asks, do we build on the first milestone and send in both? Donna, that is up to you. You will only be given feedback and graded on these 3 elements. So Anthony asks, is it okay to use a graph chart here? Yeah, sure. Depending on what you want to show, absolutely. Like I mentioned, you might want to draw your own little aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. That's fine. If you want to show changes in tax rates in a graph form, that's great. If you want to show changes in government spending, that's great too. But again, make sure that it's focused on the policy side. Sometimes government looks like it's spending more money, even though the policy hasn't changed. It's just because the country is growing. So we don't want to kind of intermingle those. And then do remember, especially if you're not going to just attach this onto the milestone 1, if you're just going to submit these slides, just the slides that you're being graded on, make sure that you still include a reference slide. You will still be graded on, articulation of response, which includes, any spelling and grammar mistakes and definitely citations and a reference list. So cite anything on the slide that needs to be cited. If it's something that you borrowed, cite it on the slide. Ditto for the notes section. In your explanations, if you're borrowing information or quoting information from a source, cite it just like you would in a paper. And then anything that has an in-text citation definitely has got to show up on your reference list. All right, I see some people typing, so I'm just waiting to see if there's any questions. All right, looks like people are pretty set with this. All right, well, if you guys don't have any other questions, I will give you back 5 minutes of your night. If anything pops up between now and Sunday, hopefully much before Sunday, but if you have any questions that you're just maybe not sure how to address it, you're not sure how it applies to your decade, or if you're struggling to find some information, do let your instructor know. And especially on the research side, if you're having any struggles, use that chat with the librarian feature. And they're a great help with that. And definitely on the economic policy side, making sense of it. If you're not sure, does this count as fiscal policy? That's a question for your instructor. and if you're unsure how to apply the macroeconomic models, like the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, definitely take that question to your instructor as soon as you have it. They'll be happy to work that out with you. So did we get graded on how the slides look? My professor said that the formatting needed to change, but I pretty much had all the information in the notes. I mean, Steph, you do get graded somewhat on the look of the slides through the articulation of response bit. If the content is there, you're satisfying the criteria of the element, but you just might want to balance the slide, and you don't want to be too empty, especially since you're not giving this at a huge lecture hall presentation where people in the back need to be able to read it. You know, I know that you might read some PowerPoint advice that's like, you can't have more than this many words on the slide, but really you have to know your audience and you have to know the situation. So at the end of the day, the situation is that you're not presenting this to a huge room full of people. Someone is reading it, and so still you don't want to write paragraphs and paragraphs on a slide, because that's not what a PowerPoint slide is about. That really should stay in the notes. But you might be able to put a little bit more on the slide than you would if you were presenting to 500 people in a huge room. So Tim said, can I get a quick few more examples of principles? There are plenty of terms we are learning quick. What constitutes principle? Tim, that's just any of the things that explain the macroeconomic theory. So just the idea of, what is GDP? What is GDP made of? GDP is made of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So anything that impacts those bits is going to impact GDP and then impact GDP growth. So that's an example. Some of the things we've discussed are like the multiplier effect. That's one of the principles that we've learned about. The models are like the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Again, just the GDP formula, you could consider a model, a simple model. The Keynesian, the consumption function is another one. So those are some of the things, to consider specific to this element. To this milestone. Paula, I agree. A lot of people really prefer to write a paper, but one of the things we want to make sure that all of our students leave their business core courses with is comfort with PowerPoint. So there are a handful of courses in the undergraduate business core that require PowerPoints for that very reason. My husband works for a Fortune 500 company, and he works with Fortune 500 companies, and they do PowerPoints all day long. It's still very much used in the everyday business world. I use them all the time at work for stuff I do internally. I used it when I used to work at General Motors. We used it all the time. So it's just a useful business skill to have. So that's why we try to incorporate it throughout the program. Does anyone know how to save this PowerPoint as a PDF? Oh, with speaker notes on a Mac, Shay. I don't know how different it is, but I bet you can YouTube it, is my suggestion. I'm sorry that I don't know how it works on a Mac. That's been our only little bug. Paula, yeah. Summer is tough. It is a challenge to do something brand new when the schedule is not the normal schedule. I know it's been mucking up with me too, especially if you have kids. I'm sure a lot of you guys have kids, so summer's tricky. Steph, thank you so much for sharing with Shay. I hope that's how it works for our Mac. All right, looks like some people are typing. I don't know if we have any more questions. Just want to make sure I don't miss anything before we sign off for the night. Thanks, Tim. Hopefully that works if the other suggestions don't. All right. Well, thank you guys all so much for coming tonight. And